my work is centered around decisions and how we can use technology to support. What I've been always interested in is how can we use information and information technology to help people make better decisions. And that sounds a bit trivial because, there's now so much information out there. And there's a hope that somehow you put this information together, you make a recommendation, and then you get to this. People just understand what is correct and will take the route to that. And if you look a bit around, you see that that is still a very popular narrative. I hear that's just a couple of pictures that I found where people promise that if only we had better data, we get to better decisions, and actually, in the SDG case, also better lives. Luckily, here in the tech and innovation, you see better technology plus better data equals better decision, and you can find it all out in just a 2-minute read. First solved, okay? Not quite. That's, I always say, one of my most favorite paper titles ever. So we observe, especially in crisis and disasters, but I think we can broaden it from that we know more. We definitely have more and more data, but somehow we, as humanity, are not always able to act upon. And then, of course, I ask myself a question, why is that? And I've been working, you heard that, on resilience and on crisis and disaster management throughout my whole career, because I find this is really a very nice testing ground for a lot of problems that also occur on a broader scale when we talk about sustainable development and transitions, for instance, of our cities, of our infrastructure systems. Okay, so I started off with trying to understand what are the key problems. That's still from when I was working on an EU project for my PhD. So we tried to understand how we can, that's a language, nodding. It's right up here, Eddie. So we were trying to understand how we could connect humans and artificial agents to support reasoning and to route the right information to people that need that information, and then always focus on decision making. So the basic question was always not just how can we make sure that the pipelines are full, that we route as much information as possible to everyone, but how can we target information to get there? Okay, so that's where I started out. And then a couple of years later, I had the opportunity to also do some field research. And that is an example from Typhoon Haiyan, that hit the Philippines at that time. And where we were trying to come in with technology and understand how we could support coordination and logistics in the field. But where I also realized that at some point, not everything was rational. And that sounds like a very dumb realization. But it was incredibly useful because a lot of the paradigms that we are using throughout information to support decision making, to optimize any kind of problem, are rooted in the idea of a rational decision maker. Still are to a large extent. And Herbert Simon was also mentioned already yesterday somewhere. Of course, we already know that rationality, concepts like bounded rationality have also been around for a while and trying to understand how people then reason, but there is still that friction between what we want to and can model and what we want to and do optimize for and what people actually do. So, and since then, we're trying to put this all together, where I said mostly for me in the context of crisis, because that's like a lens on a lot of problems. So, and then one of you said that I had a visiting position at the Philippines, actually at a lab for decision making there. And there was, an older professor in this theory who always said, "But what is so different in crisis?" And I said, but can you really try to pinpoint it? And I say, look, after years of thinking about that question, which is also not as trivial as it sounds, for me it's 3 things. It's complexity, that we have for many problems, but then combined with urgency, which really changes behavior, and with the underlying values that are affected often in crisis. And I'm going to one by one go through each of these challenges. Okay, complexity, and connected to that, what do we measure? I had to fit this in. What Dirk already mentioned is, we were working together on that report for strategic crisis management in Europe. So the European Union actually has a science advice mechanism that very few people know. And we were working together with a working group on producing that evidence report that was then later on turned into advice for the Commission, particularly for ECHO. Was a very interesting process. I learned a lot from that. We'll come back to later, but Dirk was certainly, one of the most productive members, always there. And, I was thinking like a super busy person, of course, but always the first to deliver pieces of text and extremely reliable. So thanks for that, and very pleasant to work with. What we said in that report is basically, there's complexity and more complexity. So there are systemic risk, that they're increasingly cascading effects. We have protracted crises, not just the natural disasters that I showed you for the Philippines that are a shock when you get further from it. We had transboundary problems and all of that. We argued in that report that risk and crisis management actually have to be solved together. But in principle, this boils down to is complex, because everything is linked with everything. Okay? And what then institutions like the JRC do is nice resilience dashboards, like this. And that's allegedly, I said it's for decisions, it's my talk, so that's supposed to support decision making. Now, also in context of the report, we had the opportunity to present it to one for commissioners. And, you see how these people work. They look at a piece of advice with a very, complicated problem, and they need to decide relatively quickly. Can I see it like that? Yeah. Okay, so what can we do? So we are, of course, striving to reduce that complexity to make it digestible to somebody who has to make very heavy decisions in a short amount of time. But that means we are using data and models to often, and that's now resilience vulnerability research, to both measure something, but also to define it. Because what we do with that data and how we aggregate it defines the concept. Often also driven by data availability. That here is a slide in the context of an EU project that we are currently running, which is about high-impact, low-probability disasters. In that context, we ran a big survey among emergency responders and professionals, and we asked them, if we look at disaster response and vulnerability, what are for you the key factors that determine the outcomes? And what you can mostly see, apart from some level of preparedness and exposure is somehow important, that is very colorful. So there's not much consensus of, this is the single factor that determines everything. What you also see, and that's probably a bit smaller table, is that really experience and where people have worked, in which context really matters, and shapes, for instance, what they find important. Something like high level of exposure or low economic development, as here, is important for people that worked in diverse sets of countries. Probably because if you only work in Switzerland or in the Netherlands, there is not much low economic development. Okay, so that's more on the data side. But then we also worked, I call it data versus experts. We worked with data from Burkina Faso, together with 510, that's initiative of the Dutch Red Cross, to try and understand, if we have the same data sets, and we use two different approaches to assess, in that case, vulnerability, we somehow would expect similar results because there are two approaches. Inform is expert-driven, so experts from the European Commission and from the UN determine the ways their data was aggregated. This is an approach that Susan Cutter promoted, based on principal component analysis. Okay, what you can already see, same country, same data set, kind of looks different. Okay, you can make that even more clear. So you see that the country that were the most vulnerable with the PCA, the communes, that were the most vulnerable with the PCA, are among the least vulnerable with decent harm, which is promoted by the Commission, and vice versa. Also, because yesterday was the International Day of Women and Girls in Science, I decided to highlight all my female co-authors, just to give them some attention and publicity. So, we have that. And if you also know that funding is decided based on these assessments, and that sort of, at least in my experience, decision makers, policymakers don't really want to go into something like data aggregation, then it becomes critical. Because people can have long fights about which data to include and which data is available. But when it comes then to what we do with that data, how we process it, how we combine it, then it's like, no, that's for somebody else. Okay, Heath. Maybe you don't, as Netherlands, yeah. Maybe you don't expect that is a hot country, not sort of famous as hot, but it increasingly also has these heat islands, especially in the urban areas. What we did there is try to understand which features drive vulnerability to heat. And to that end, we collected data from 3 different Dutch cities, Rotterdam, Amsterdam, and The Hague, and tried to understand which population groups were the most vulnerable to the heat by the number of underland calls that were made during specifically hot periods in these regions. And what you can see here is that that's Rotterdam, that's The Hague. There, what happens is maybe what you expect, that it's primarily the low-income households that are in the first cluster, so the most prominent one to heat. In Amsterdam, that's different. So the low-income households are still represented, but there is mostly the 65 plus people with health issues. And if we then think about, okay, normally these vulnerability assessments are the same for any city, then you see immediately that that is difficult because the context really matters. What makes people vulnerable in Rotterdam is not the same as what makes them vulnerable in Amsterdam. So it's really questioning if we can have these generalized approaches. And another thing we did is then also testing vulnerability and resilience, which are often used as flip sides. I'm not going to talk so much about this one. But we see it's not. It's really a relationship that is not like one is the opposite of the other. And why is that? So you would expect in a city, for instance, green blue spaces are the least vulnerable, right? Because there is cooler. But of course, what happens is people, especially in the greatest heat, go to green blue spaces, to parks, to the coast, where there's water. And that's why these places become then suddenly hotspots of where, people get health issues, for instance. So we really have to integrate the temporal aspects and also behavior into our assessments. Okay, that's the gist of it. Context matters. And it's really not clear all our models and assessments are generalizable. If we can have the one assessment that fits all. Okay. Fine. Second point, urgency. We had a lot of urban talks, especially yesterday. And of course, also in resilience, that's a panarchy. We know that especially in cities, there are many different systems. Some of them are slow moving, some of them are fast moving, and we'd have to think about them together. Now, so one of my PhD students on the top, she's actually an architect by training. And I really learned a lot from her. Because when I met her, she was like, but we really have to think about how we get our cities ready for climate change. And okay. So we had infrastructure planning, and we just think 100 years ahead, and then we do climate projection, and that's it. And then she said, no, you're so naive, non-architects. Because that's not how cities are planned. There are urban master plans that typically have a span of about 15 to 20, maybe 25 years. And there are also only very few scenarios that are considered. I was like, that's strange. Because for some infrastructure, we still see the footprint of Roman roads across Europe. So there are not people there for 100 years, there are for thousands of years there. How can we get into it? So we started also to map out urban planning timescales, and then this interlinkage at the intersection of the different infrastructures, and then also try to understand how disruptions we are facing could come in. Why is that important? There's other research that we did on Helsinki. Well, why Helsinki? Because it has great open data. But also because it had a big financial crisis that hit Scandinavia in the 1990s. So what we did there, we analyzed how Helsinki and the different neighborhoods and communities of Helsinki recover from that crisis. And of course, Helsinki, it's Finland. So a lot of investment, a lot of social support, a lot of attempts to integrate these connections between the city in different plans. But we saw that the differences between the different regions of the city that had been caused by that crisis persist. And they persist until, early 90s it happened. We could track them back until 2060 in an analysis where we really took different infrastructure data and looked at how the city was evolving, socioeconomic data as well. And that means that a shock, which is often dealt with as a very sort of short-term event that we respond to, has these long-term repercussions, and that crises are really inflection points that define even the growth of our cities for decades. And then we tried to put everything that we know about the growth of cities into a land use change model. That's Amsterdam. And we worked on that also with urban planners to try to confront them with that. So that's Amsterdam in 2050. To try to understand where a city would grow, but also get feedback. So we calibrated the model. We asked them, okay, so is that how you envision the city? Mostly they say no, because that can't be. But we also tested different policies for that. For that work, actually, it's also run price, which was nice to her. But we, for instance, looked at different scenarios of risk avoidance versus risk minimization. What could you, for instance, with different policies, reduce in flood damage? And that has been picked up, is it by Allianz and also by different decision makers. Another point I was already alluding to a bit yesterday. So she's from India, from Mumbai, actually. We also tried to do that from Mumbai. Okay. Remember fancy looking at Amsterdam? Mumbai was like a magnitude more difficult. Why is it? Because it was so much harder to get later there. Even though she is a native from Mumbai, it was also harder to speak to people there. And it took a lot of manual drawing of maps and working with data to calibrate a model. Interestingly, Mumbai will also have a problem with climate change as Amsterdam, but not because sea level rises into areas that are now populated, but because it will expand into low-lying areas. The point is also that there is a lot of inequality, also in our research, because often it's hard to get data and to work with other contexts than the ones and motivated our choice to Helsinki that are easy to accept. So short-term response create long-term path dependencies, but also urgency drives often, that's not so prominent on the slides here, but it drives myopic behavior. We tend, in the response to a crisis, ignore the future and rebuild what we had, not seeing what it will come to. Third aspect, values. Okay, I was talking already about the Sapir report we did for the commission. We had, when we were starting that report, that was in 2021, they were already at the Polish-Belarusian border, refugees. It had been pushed in. And we were asking sort of in the scoping of that report, well, should we include migrant or refugee crisis? And they said no, because that's political. Apparently COVID was not political, but okay. Nobody will touch that because it's so value-created. Fast forward a couple of months, so the war in Ukraine had started and there were a lot of Ukrainian refugees that came into Europe. All of a sudden it was like, well, but now we really need to have information about how to deal with all these refugees here in Europe. But what I want to say is that this is something that people don't want to touch because it is political, and therefore we ignore a good part of crisis away. And not only we, but also countries put people, refugees and IDP settlements into areas which are actually already very much exposed to climate extreme events. So basically, if you want to think about where you put your refugee or IDP settlement, it's basically in the worst corner of the countries where it can be, and where it's already overloading the most populations. Final point, I think also alluding to what we did yesterday. We are working also with the IPC, the international, so basically trying to understand food security classifications, which is very much driven by a consensus process, whereby experts declare, case of Malawi, whether a country needs assistance because there is famine or not. They try to do that now more data-driven, which means that the experts get sort of a data warehouse where there's a lot of JPEGs and PDFs that they can look at together. Okay, then they do an analysis, which is a painful process. And in principle, we talked about lead times and lags yesterday already. So they stick with their prognosis until basically the famine is already there, because there's no easy process to redo a prognosis for a country. It's very high. Okay, so then we work with these projection assumptions on how will specific factors, variables contribute to something like food security, and what would happen. And then we started to work, so we wanted to do digitalization, AI, like cool food security stuff there, before we realized, well, that's not even possible because it's so low tech and we need to really take a step back. And then we worked with them in a process on just trying to understand how they set and then potentially can combine these projections, which was completely not what we had wanted to do. We also had got a lot of pushback from the organization to do even that, because they were saying, well, these people, our local analysts, will certainly not understand this. Too complicated. Well, also that is a message of don't underestimate your local experts. Don't dumb it down too much, because actually they found it quite feasible and also useful. But sort of the key message, the idea of putting together something for the humans, that takes a lot of time. So we had several meetings, evaluations, policy documents to get access to these 20 experts with whom we were working with in Malawi, like concept notes and so forth. And we also had to deviate from the idea to build a cool, nice new model to do something that's actually useful. And now we are trying to build on it. Final comments, I know it already rang. Infrastructure is also an important part of the puzzle. There's FuseNet, that's an early warning system for food security that has been hosted by USAID. Yeah, so you can know what is going on there. And I think also, well, we have to think about, if we build this infrastructure and these models, where and how do we host it? And how do we make sure that it can be accessed and accessible irrespective sort of what happens?